I think we may as well start. So, we are recording this, by the way, but I will switch the mic, the camera from you in a moment. But I would like to introduce, and let's see if I'm not sure how I can do this. Get the speaker only. There we are. Okay, I would like to introduce Jess. And now Vickruck, is that correct? Vickruck? Okay, good. She is a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-food Canada, based in Fredericton. She completed an undergraduate degree from the University of Guelph, MSc and a PhD from Brock University in Ontario. And her research is primarily interested in how wild bees use agricultural landscapes and how we can manage those landscapes to increase wild bee biodiversity and the pollination services those bees bring. Okay. So wonderful. You're on. Thank you.
All right. I should have shared my screen earlier because this is always the
Okay.
point of contention here. Which screen am I sharing? Share the right screen. But every time's an adventure.
Okay.
How's
Well,
that?
yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Awesome. So yeah, thanks for having me. I can no longer see myself, so hopefully I don't make too many ridiculous faces. My name's Jess. Um, I spend most of my time here in Fredericton. Yeah, I'm originally from a little place called Vineland, which is not surprisingly where there are a lot of vineyards. So I was there for most of my life. I spent some time out in Calgary as a postdoc. And then I've been in Fredericton since 2019. So since, oh geez, a while now. I've been working primarily on wild bees, which sort of have a little smattering of images there. So they're, quite diverse. And sort of the idea of this talk is just to give everyone some background on wild bee biodiversity and some life history and bees that are sort of common in our area and what you can do if you want to see more of them around in your garden. So globally across the globe, we have more than 20,000 different species of bee. And that number is almost continually growing. Um, when I first started working with wild bees, there was a big project to sort of survey the bees of Canada. And at the time, I think we approximated that there were about 800 species of bee, and we're up to 927. So the more research we do, the more we go looking, and the more different species we see. So these are three images that I've just pulled to sort of give you an idea of just the sort of wild difference in body shape and size and color. And that bee on the left um, is tiny, and the bee on the right is, probably an inch and a half. They're quite large. So massive diversity of shapes, sizes, colors. One of the first things I always tell people about bees, especially most you guys are probably a more educated crowd than a lot that I speak to, but that most bees are actually solitary. So more than 70% of the bees that we have, especially in Canada, it's one female that does all of the work. So that means that there are no workers. Typically, the males only exist for 3 to 4 weeks. They basically emerge. They mate as many times as they can. They basically just mate and mate and mate until they die. And then that one female does all of the work, all of the pollen collection, as well as all of the egg laying by herself. There are what we call eusocial species. And so these are what we would think of as your honeybees and your bumblebees and some of your stingless bees as you move further south. Um, and in temperate climates like here, what we typically see is that there is one large bee that who becomes the queen who overwinters by herself. And in the spring, she founds the colony alone. So in the spring, she acts as a solitary female. She does all of the pollen collection. She lays the eggs. And then once that first round of eggs emerge, grow up, become adults, then that cohort of individuals becomes her workers. And at that point, she stays in the nest So that's sort of depicted. You can see my cursor here. But so once she has workers, then she stays in the nest, and the workers then become the ones that are doing the foraging, doing all the pollen collection and bringing everything back. And then late in the summer and into the early fall, the queens will lay male eggs to make workers. And these other bees that are large queens, we call these gynes, and these are the bees that will become next year's queens. Mating happens in the fall, the males die off, the workers die off, and then those gynes find a place to overwinter, and then the cycle begins again. So one of the really sort of neat tidbits about bees and wasps, so all of the Hymenoptera are that is that they're haplodiploid. So the females are diploid, like humans are. They carry two copies of every gene, but the males are haploid. And the females have the ability to store sperm. They have a sperm storage organ. So anytime a female goes to lay an egg, she can decide whether to fertilize that egg or not. And if she lays an unfertilized egg, she lays a male egg. And if she lays a fertilized egg, she lays a female egg. And so they actually have the ability to control when and how many males are laid in a nest at any given time. And then the sort of the last bee life history strategy are those that are parasitic. And these are really fun. They're sort of, I call them the freeloader bees. They don't actually collect any of their own pollen. They sneak into the nests of other bees when they're gone. So in the case of a solitary bee, if she's out collecting pollen, a parasitic bee will sneak in. Often they'll lay their egg, usually destroy the egg that was there and lay their egg on top of it. And then those bees raise the parasitic bees brood as their own. So they're a really fun group of bees. Interestingly, we often think of parasitic species. If we can find parasitic species in a bee community, that is actually it's a healthy community, which is a little bit counterintuitive maybe. But basically what it means is that there's enough of its host there that the parasitic species can find them and survive. So as I mentioned previously, a lot of bees live in the ground. So these little red dots here are little red arrows are actually pointing to individual ground nests. They're very sneaky. They can be tricky to find. And when bees aren't actively leaving and coming back to the nest, they'll cover those over. Or if it's raining, they cover them over. So you just can't see them. So they're quite common. Out in New Brunswick, there's also a lot of bees that really like to nest in twigs. So they actually will dig a little tunnel. They need a twig that's broken off so the pith is exposed. And then they'll dig a little tunnel down into the twig. So you can see here, this is a raspberry twig on the left. And each one of these sort of compartments here, this is a pollen ball. So there's one big pollen ball with an egg laid on it. And the female will make sort of each of these little rooms, and then she'll sit at the top here. But very common in raspberry, rose, sumac, things that have pithy stems. Cracks and crevices. There's a whole group of bees that love like the cracks in between the sidewalk or little spaces in between two rocks. This species of bee over here obligately nests in rotting wood. And there's a few that actually obligately nest in snail shells. So each empty snail shell becomes the home of one egg. There's some really cool videos on YouTube if you're ever bored. You can watch them. They almost make a little house around the snail shell once they've laid an egg inside it. It's pretty awesome. So the big difference I say to people when between wasps and bees is that bees are vegetarians. So bees only consume pollen and nectar, whereas wasps are carnivores. So they have to feed their offspring, things like aphids and little caterpillars and things like that. So they're vegetarians. We have sort of fancy words. Specialist bees are bees that have obligate relationships with a specific group of flowers. So this can be a species of bee that will only collect pollen from a certain family of flower. In some certain cases, it can be as specific as one species of bee, one species of flower. We call these bees oligolectic bees. But most bees are generalists, and these are bees that will collect pollen and nectar from essentially any kind of flower that they can find. So down here at the bottom, we have, this is an image from my PhD when I used to mark a lot of these are large carpenter bees, which we don't actually have in New Brunswick, although they are in Maine. And I expect that with climate change, we will see them here not too long from now. This is a really big pollen ball, and this is an egg. So you can see how massive this egg is. It's about half the size of this bee's abdomen. So the egg represents a huge investment of resources and energy for that bee. So they take good care of their offspring. So there's a wide variety of different ways that bees will collect this pollen. Uh, the most sort of commonly known one probably is I have an arrow here, is a corbicula or a pollen basket. So we call it a pollen basket, but it's actually this really shiny, flat, concave surface, and bees will actually pack it in. There's actually some sort of tines here to help scrape off the other side, and they pack it into the sort of large orangey colored balls that you'll often see on the sides of bumblebees and honeybees, and a whole group of bees that we actually call the corbiculate bees because they all have a corbicula. Most bees will collect pollen with scopa, and scopa are basically just special pollen collecting hairs. And what makes them special is that if you zoom in on a microscope on one of these hairs, it actually looks like a Christmas tree. So it's a branching hair, which really helps the pollen to stick to it. And while most bees have an abundance of scopa on their legs, you can see here that the pollen will stick pretty much anywhere. And so you can imagine that this is quite good for pollination, and because lots of this pollen is going to sort of fall off everywhere as bees are moving from one different flower to the other. A group of bees called the Megachilidae, they actually carry all their scopa on the underside of their abdomen. So you can see here there's less hair, less of these really long hairs on their legs, and most of it is on as my kids think is really funny, I say it's on the underside of their butts. So sometimes if you see a bee flying around and it looks like the underside of its body is very yellow or orange, that's probably a bee from the family Megachilidae, and that's where they carry their pollen, is under there. And this is a funky looking bee. This is actually quite a small bee. It's only about a centimeter. It's from the family Calididae. And if you look at it, it looks very wasp-like because it doesn't really have any, it's not very hairy, doesn't have any scopa on its legs or on the underside of its abdomen, really. And this group of bee is kind of funny because it actually ingests all of its pollen and nectar. So it consumes all of it, and then it gets back to the nest and it regurgitates it. Or again, if you're my kids, they puke it back up, which is pretty funny. So when we start to think about promoting wild bees and maintaining spaces that are beneficial for them, probably I always joke that bees need a food, shelter, and a short commute. So from the food side of things, it's important to think about having flowers around that are in bloom all year. So, typically there's lots of, sort of an abundance of floral resources in June and July, those early flowers in the spring and the late flowers into that sort of like August, September, October that are usually harder to come by. Like, I don't know if we have a bunch of asters, which was these purple guys here, goldenrods, and they're usually just crawling, absolutely crawling with bees when in later on in the fall, because there's not that much available. In the spring, things like willows, this is some bunchberry here. A lot of early flowering trees and shrubs actually are really useful for that early season pollen. So pollen across the year is really important for bee biodiversity. They also need nest sites. Um, so this is a image of an Andrena female poking her head out of, I actually have an aggregation in my backyard. That's really fun. Every spring we go watch them. These are a very early season bee. They tend to be one of the first bees that you see active in the spring. The males look hysterical because they just look like they're just got out of bed like all the time. They have really sort of scraggly hair. This is a female who's just poking her head out. So having places for them to be, you can imagine that, a paved spot is not great. Somewhere that gets repeatedly mulched, like so if you mulch over a nest, that can be tricky. Having, bumblebees tend to often nest in the ground, but they're cavity nesters, so they're not going to dig a hole. They're looking for an old abandoned mouse burrow or a cavity next to. Quite often, people will call me because there's a bumblebee nest that's, next to the house because there's a space that's eroded next to the foundation and there's a little cavity. And so a bumblebee queen will take up a nest in there. There's a little small carpentry butt sticking out of a twig. So just having an availability of different nest sites. These are another, again, ground nests. This is actually in a blueberry field. And then a short commute. So if you think about bees in a landscape, bees are what we call central place foragers, which just means that they spend a lot of time investing in a house and a home. Humans are central place foragers. We have a home, we leave our home, we come back to our home, as opposed to different other species that, are more nomadic or have a territory, but not necessarily one specific place that they come back to every time. So you can imagine, just like I grew up outside of Toronto, and I had lots of friends that had to commute to Toronto, and they would spend, 2 hours in a train on the way there and 2 hours in a train on the way home. You have less time to do other things in your day if you're spending your whole day driving around, or in this case, flying. So you can imagine that if the bee is flying, has a flower that's close to it versus a bee that has a flower that's quite far away, this has implications for basically the overall fitness of the nest. So it means that they can make fewer pollen trips in a day, so they can visit fewer flowers in a day, lay fewer eggs in a day. It also means that they accumulate wing wear faster. So often one of the things that keeps females, or that sort of dictates the end of their life, is that they will actually wear their wings so thin that they're tattered, there are holes in them. They've lost so much surface area on the edges of their wings that they can't get off the ground anymore. So you can imagine that if they have to fly further, they're going to pick up that wing wear faster. And then they also have higher levels of parasitism. So those social parasites that I talked about a few slides ago, so if a bee is gone for a longer period of time, that leaves her nest available for one of those social parasites to come in. So having food across the season, somewhere that they can nest that's close to it, and then abundant food around it, is really important. I'm going to quickly give you some info about our bees in Canada. I mentioned that we have 927 species, and those come from 5 different families. So probably the most diverse family in terms of the different numbers of species are from the family Halictidae. So these are called sweat bees, and that actually sort of comes from reports of them landing on your arms or on your body in the summer, and they'll actually lick the sweat off of you, which I think is adorable. Some people think is terrifying, but they're quite small. Very often ground nesters. These is 2 examples. They have a very sort of typical body shape. So they have some beautiful colors, with like some metallic greens. There's quite a number of these that are actually social as well. So we'll have queens and workers, but very common. We have the Andrenidae, or the mining bees. So this is some pictures from my nest. This is one of those males. So we call them mining bees because they dig in the ground. Some of the genus Andrena are really excellent pollinators of blueberry. They tend to be, like I said, an early season bee. They're very cute. That's a male hanging out of my finger in the spring, but abundant as well. So the Apidae, so this includes honeybees and bumblebees. I don't know if I've mentioned or not, but just to make sure everyone is on the same page. So honeybees actually are not native to North America. Europeans brought honeybees over with us when we colonized North America. So they're actually an introduced species. But bumblebees are also a member of the family Apidae, as are carpenter bees. So that's that nest I showed you before, and this is a picture of a small carpenter bee. They are also lovely and blue and metallic. They're easy to tell the males and the females apart in this genus, because the females have like a little white nose, and the males have like a full triangle white face. So they're very fun. I studied this group for my master's, and they are super lovely. The Megachilidae, so these are the mason and leaf cutter bees. So those are the ones that I mentioned before. They carry the pollen on the undersides of their abdomen. So it's a little orange abdomen here. But the leaf cutters especially, they're called leaf cutters because they actually line the inside of their nests with leaves. And so if you've ever noticed a plant in your garden or nearby and you look at it and it has a whole bunch of little semicircles cut out of it, those are leaf cutter bees. So they're probably visiting the flowers of whatever plant that is, and then also cutting leaves to line the insides of their nests. For protection and have some antifungal properties. There's a really fun species. I think it's over at like in the Middle East, and it only uses rose petals to line the inside of its nest. So it cuts little semicircles out of rose petals, and that is what it uses. Pretty awesome. And then the Calididae are the plaster or polyester bees. So this is that group that I showed you before that regurgitates its pollen. More fun facts about these groups. Hylaeus would probably be the most common genus in the Maritimes. They also are twig nesters, but they don't dig their own tunnels. Usually they like to use little sort of, if there's a hole in the pith down the middle, and they call them polyester bees because they line the insides of their nest with this what a glandular secretion. It almost looks like they've saran wrapped the outside of their nest, which is an antimicrobial thing. And if you happen to be handling them and you make them angry, everything smells like lemon. So Maritimes, we're looking at this point at least, and these are rough estimates because we've just started doing a lot more surveys of the species that we have here. So this is certainly an underestimate of how many species we're looking at. About 100, over 175 species. Most of them are ground nesters. Again, most of them are social or solitary, sorry. The eusocial species largely are from your bumblebees and some of your sweat bees, and some of them are parasitic. 87 of them are generalists, so they'll collect pollen from any flowers that are available. About 21 of them are oligolectic. And it's to highlight, so 76 that we have no reported floral association. So just to give you an idea of, just sort of generally how little we know about a lot of the species that are around us is that we don't have any reported floral associations for a huge chunk, more than a third of the bees. This is an awesome male of Megachile latimanus. They have these hilarious hair fringes that you see here on its front legs. And when they mate with the females, they actually wrap their arms around the female's eyes. And I read a paper, really old paper, but hypothesized that males of different species have different hair fringes, and the females can tell when the males are mating with them if the hair fringe is in the right shape over her eyes, and that's how she'll either accept a male or reject him. But they're hilarious looking. So in terms of species that we find in Atlantic Canada that are at risk, there are actually a few. So this is the rusty-patched bumblebee. So this is Bombus affinis, which is hypothesized to exist up here. So the range map for this species is here in the middle. And you can see that it doesn't actually venture up into New Brunswick, but based on what we know, we think that it could exist here. This used to be one of the most common bees that we had, especially in that sort of southern Ontario, like sort of in the center of its range in the 70s. It was a super, super common bee. I'm trying to think of it's very, haven't seen one in southern Ontario in a really, really long time. But it sort of has this distinctive rusty patch right here. So, and here we have some common floral associations, milkweed, gray clover, jewelweed, things like that. So this is a species, the yellow-banded bumblebee, that we do actually, so it is a species of special concern, according to Cusiwek. This is a bee that I do actually see in New Brunswick. It's not super, super common, but we definitely have it here. I've run into it not infrequently. It is also hypothesized to be the host species for another parasitic bee that I think is my next slide. So it's the host for this other parasite. And it's a very distinctive, sometimes they call it the yellow black bumblebee or the half black bumblebee because it has the whole back half of its thorax is black. And then the first tergite is also black. So it is relatively common as the rare things go. So Bombus bohemicus is hypothesized to be, so this is a cuckoo bumblebee, so it is a social parasite. So it actually sneaks into the nest of this bee to take over its nest. So you can imagine that if the host is declining, then the parasite is going to have an even harder time finding it. So it's going to be harder to keep that species around as well. This species has an enormous range. I have never seen one in the Maritimes. I actually was just in contact with a colleague this afternoon who sent me a picture of one that he took in the Yukon. So it's a species that has a massive, massive range, but across that range is just exceedingly rare, which is kind of interesting. And this is sort of our last one again, very, very rare. Uh, Another cuckoo bumblebee that has a huge range, uh, all the way, ranging all the way across Canada. But interestingly enough, so those are the four species that, according to COSEWIC, are listed as, threatened or endangered. Uh, and if you notice, they're all bumblebees. And that is very likely not because it is only bumblebees that are declining, although we do have lots of research to show that bumblebees are not doing well when it comes to climate change and sort of exposure to pathogens and parasites and things. But it's just that we're not monitoring a lot of the other species enough to know that species are declining. So, um, it's good to have this information on these bumblebees, but there's a lot more knowledge to gain before we make any sort of grand statements about a lot of the other bees that are out there. So I love I love this picture. It says, "Why are you dressed like this? Then why does your yard still look like this?" Um, And then underneath in little font, it says 18th century style yards are no longer environmentally sustainable. It's time to adjust the aesthetics of our yards. So if you're if you're looking to sort of, promote pollinator biodiversity, but really biodiversity of a lot of, biodiversity generally, um, one of the big sort of answers is just to not to let your yard be a little bit messy. Don't worry about your perfect yard. I know in Ontario they've banned pesticide or herbicide applications, for cosmetic purposes in yards, but they haven't done that in New Brunswick. So I mean, you don't need to spray crap on your yard. Um, if you're pruning a bush, if you have a rose bush or a raspberry bush, don't trim your stems all the way down. Leave 20 to 30 centimeters for those bees to make their nests. The really cool thing about that is that the carpenter bees will only use those twigs for one season. They only use them for a year. But then when they're done, then other creatures move in. Like you quite often find spiders in there. You find you'll find small beetles in there. I even found another set of megachilids in there that were using it as like a trap nest. So you're creating all these little microhabitats for other organisms to use as well. If you can, try and not use a ton of mulch. I know that there's advantages for other things, but for your ground nesting bees, they can't get into their nests and they can't find them if there's a whole bunch of mulch on top. Um, so if you can try not to mulch everything all the time, that is also sort of a big help. Um, and if you're, sort of actively planning a garden, or if you're looking to add things to your garden, to think about what else you have. And if you can add spaces or add flowers to fill in gaps across the bloom season, be that early or late. Typically, most people have things that are blooming sort of midsummer because that's when a lot of things are in bloom. But if you think about early and late season flowers, um, and this is it's a challenging one, but if you can find native plants, that is great. There's a lot of research that has shown that because um, the relationship between the bee and the pollinator, or the bee and the flower has been, happening for millions of years, that they're actually better, native plants and native bees are sort of there's they work better together than with introduced plants. But and it's starting to come, but the more we ask for native plants, the more greenhouses and the people that are producing these things will start to carry them and will start to produce them, because it's usually based on consumer demand. So I know out west there's starting to be, like native plant nurseries and things like that. It's definitely more of a challenge here, but it'll come. So if you're looking for resources, because everyone's always looking for resources, there's this Grow Me Instead guide that came out a couple of years ago, and I can send the link in the chat if anyone's interested. It's just a PDF that was put together by the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia Invasive Species Council, and it's a good one. But if you are looking for a book, this is my favorite book. If you can see it, you can see me. But this Northern Gardener's Guide to Native Plants and Pollinators is wonderful. It has information on all of the flowers that it's talking about. It even has like suggested pairings across it. It gives you sample gardens. It's just a wonderful resource. I think I've purchased copies and given it to most of my family at this point. There's also another one, Lorraine Johnson again, same, but I have it in my presentation, but it's 100 easy to grow native plants. It's also a good one. And if any of you guys have any good resources, I'm always looking for more resources on that front to share. So other ways to get involved if you're interested, there's Bumblebee Watch. So Bumblebee Watch is a really awesome organization that uses community science to help track populations of all bumblebees across North America. So there is an app on your phone now, but traditionally what would happen is you would take a photo, you create an account, you can upload your photo, and then there are actually groups of experts that have been certified, and they come through and they will actually identify your bee for you. And so that it's been a really incredible resource to track bumblebee ranges and populations. So if you're a keen photographer, if you like taking photos of bees and you're out there doing it, certainly one thing, if you want to sort of put those to good use, is you can upload them to Bumblebee Watch. Another one a lot of you are probably aware of is iNaturalist and Seek. So it's sort of a very, very similar idea, but for not just bumblebees, it's for all taxa really, bee and otherwise. Um, but I tend to use with the kids, there's the Seek app, which is on your phone, and it uses the iNaturalist database. So you can take pictures of them, um, and it will make a prediction of what that species is. It's not bad. It tends to be more accurate for your larger charismatic species, but then it will also give you a range map, of how common the species is, and what other parts of the country or province you've seen it in. So that's another sort of fun way. And Seek I use a lot with the kids when we're out hiking, just because it'll do bees, but we'll also do beetles and tussock moths. And ironically, I made this slide last year, but I don't know if you guys would have seen it, but there was that sort of viral thing about tussock moths and how, you touch them and everything on you will blister. And it was like, okay, just don't, they were just hairs. But anyway, that's an aside. So hopefully haven't totally overwhelmed everyone with information, or made you fall asleep at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night. But that's really sort of all I had for you tonight, if anyone has any questions they want to ask, I would be more than happy to try and answer them.
Okay, excuse me, I'm gonna switch mics here and see if this works. So there's a microphone.
Everyone's so dark.
Oh, well, we can change that. You can see, I'm not sure what you can see. Now we're too bright.
Right.
There we go.
Okay, I'm gonna change cameras as well.
Peter, I have a question.
Oh, okay, we're still on the USB camera, yeah. Okay. Question?
Yeah, what's the main reason for the species becoming endangered or threatened?
You able to hear?
So sorry, the question was what's the reason that a species has become endangered or threatened?
Yes.
So I think it depends on the species that you're looking at. So with the rusty patch bumblebee, I think they from what they can tell, the biggest things are pathogen spillover from honeybees. So honeybee hives have their own set of diseases and mites and things like that. But when those bees meet on the flower, they can often transfer that kind of stuff. So that was a big one, and also habitat loss. For some of like the Bombus bohemicus, that one social parasite, I think, its population is declining because its host is also declining. So, yeah.
There's a word you used in the very first, maybe I heard wrong. Gynes? What is that?
A gyne, yeah. So gyne. So a gyne is a bee that is an egg that is laid in the fall, that is destined to become next year's queen. So she becomes an adult late in the fall. She will mate and then overwinter, and then in the spring she'll become the queen.
But she has laid the egg in the fall.
Yeah, so the egg is laid in the fall. It's a larva and then will become an adult, sort of maybe in September, and then the rest of the colony will die off. But there's usually more than one gyne, say like 4 or 5 gynes survive, and then they overwinter, and then they'll become the queens in the following year.
So that means there'll be more than one queen would overwinter from a
More than one queen would overwinter, but not all of those would survive the winter. And then in the spring, each of those would then have to start and found her nest. So they usually the current queen will make several gynes for the following year with the hope that at least one of them will survive and make it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I have no one. This concept of the queen just making sure that males hatch. Can you explain how she does that again?
Yeah. So the females when the females mate, they actually have it's called a spermatheca. It's almost like it's a storage organ. So they store all that sperm like inside their abdomen. But because of the way their genetics work, only fertilized eggs become female. So when a female lays an egg, she can actually decide whether to fertilize that egg or not. If she fertilizes the egg, then it becomes a female bee. And if she doesn't fertilize the egg, then it becomes a male bee.
Right.
So in theory, even a female bee that hasn't mated can lay male eggs, but not female eggs. So they can control the sex ratio of their hive or of their offspring.
There's no means of calculation, right? It's just intuitive.
Like, do you mean like she's not counting how many, like, oh, time for a male?
Yeah, it's just accidental. I mean, you make it sound like it's conscious.
It is. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. So that's why, like in a honeybee hive, um, or sorry, a honeybee or a bumblebee, any social hive, all all summer, the queen will only lay female eggs. So her nest will just be her and her workers. There won't be any male beings in there. They'll just be the queen and her workers. And then near the end of the summer, when she produces her gynes, so those bees that are going to become next year's queens, they want to mate in the fall. So she's like, "Oh, I'm making next year's queens. She's going to need some males. Now I'll make some males so that there's males for her to mate with." So yeah, it's a conscious thing they can control. If only it worked like that for people, right?
it's a little scary actually with me. Yeah, Jim.
Yes, I'd like to know the impact of roadside mowing. They seem to do it in the peak flower period. And is that impacting success or the populations of bees?
That's a really good question. So I think if it's just so sometimes we will actually suggest in some cases that mowing can be beneficial because it will cause rebloom on some of the clovers and things like that. So you'll get a second bloom if you cut it. If you're doing a lot of soil disturbance, then it's probably not great. But I guess it's different. You don't want to like mow it down to the ground, but sometimes like I mow. Um, actually can be helpful because it'll cause more blooms.
Oh, I was referring to the roadside mowing that the Departments of Transportation do. There's quite a variety of flowers along the roadside. And
Yeah,
we're talking about the short commute, and I was relating that to the forest conditions, which are a short distance from the roadside. And I was wondering if that would be impactful.
yeah, no, it certainly can be, and then there are some projects in like in the UK that have had like purpose
Yes.
built roadside flowers, um, and yeah, they're careful about if and when they mow those. The other thing with some of the roadside uh, plantings that we have to be a bit mindful of in New Brunswick too is the like salt runoff and things like that you're getting, especially for those ground nesters that are there, depending on how the drainage is happening.
Thank you.
Do bees rely on like the pollen from forest-based trees? So your pine.
Sorry,
do the bees like we are
did the
pollen from like spruce and fir and maple and birch?
yeah, they will. Yeah. We find it's interesting. So in most of a lot of the work that's been done, especially with bees and agriculture, has been done in the prairies. And so we know sort of the conventional thinking is that if you take a native prairie grassland and you convert it into you end up with less biodiversity. Um, but what we're actually finding in New Brunswick is that bees are almost attracted to the field edges of farms because here we're a lot of the time converting forest into field. And so you're starting with a different community. And quite often in the forest, there's lots of spring pollen. There's not as much late season pollen. And so the bees tend to come out of the forest to the field edges where there's more sun and then there's more flowers. So they're using the landscape differently in the Maritimes than they are in, say, like Alberta.
Could you talk about bees and stinging? I know a lot of, especially kids are afraid of bees because, they sting, but.
Yeah. So only the females have stingers because it's actually a modified egg laying device. Most bees are I would say, more than 75% of the stings that happen are usually wasps. Wasps are just inherently more aggressive. I sort of chalk it up to the fact that they are carnivores, so they're hunters, versus a bee is a vegetarian. They don't really want to bug you. So in theory, all females can sting. Some of the little, some of those bees that are only a centimeter big, the stingers are proportional to the size of the bee. So you have these little tiny bees that are suddenly like they can't even get through the skin on my finger. It's too thick. Um, so, for the most part, they're yes, they can sting, but they're not aggressive. They're not going to chase you. They're not like a wasp, like those ground nesting wasps, and they were terrible this year in like July and August. I don't know the number of times that I walked over one in the forest and then had to run because they all chased me down. But bees don't do that.
Jess, in September, our September presentation was from a gentleman from Vickruck National Park, where he's promoting pollinated gardens
Fundy,
and native plants. And I can't remember his name.
Fundy, Neil Vincent from
I
Fundy.
said Vickruck, didn't I?
Yeah.
Fundy, Neil
Vincent.
Vincent, yeah, Fundy National Park. And a lot of similar comments that you made, you also made, like just kind of you reinforce what he said and vice versa.
That's good. At least we're not contradicting each other.
How's that? No, I don't, well, anybody notice any contradiction?
I cringed a little bit. The provincial parks, a lot of the provincial parks put pollinator gardens in, but they put in a honeybee hive. They're like, look, we put in a honeybee hive. And I always cringe a little bit at that because honeybees they're an industry and they have their own set of problems, and they deal with a different set of problems than the wild bees do. Because I mean, if you don't have flowers near your honeybee hive, you just pick it up and you move it somewhere else. That being said, they also deal with like Nosema and Varroa and a whole bunch of other sort of viruses and mites and things that the wild bees don't have to deal with as much, but they're not native. They're sort of like a joke that they're like the cattle of bees. We've domesticated them, so it's sort of like, it's like saying you're gonna save the birds by having chickens in your backyard. It's not really the same thing.
I like that analogy. No, we live somewhat urban and we have a neighbor who has chickens and a rooster, so we identify with that. We're birders.
And a rooster. Well, that would be,
Yeah. Well,
you're not late.
I saw the bylaw control officer drive into their driveway yesterday, so I don't know what's happening.
You're probably not late for stuff, at least.
Well, no, it's a pleasant sound. We don't hear it in the house. We hear it outside all the time. Anyway, it's not gonna hear it. All right, I digress.
You include them in your bird count?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no. eBird wouldn't accept it. No. So yes, we are very familiar with Inapquist, but I guess the bumblebee app would be another step.
Yeah, Bumblebee Watch is fun.
Yeah.
And there's a whole group of people that identify that will go through and ID your bee for you, which is always nice. But yeah, this is a great book if anyone's looking for gifts for friends.
Not to belabor this guide thing, but these extra queens are fertilized, are they?
Yes, they usually mate in the fall, so that's why yeah.
Okay. It's a new one to me that there was more than one.
Well, there's more than one simply because it's, winters are hard and then sometimes springs can be harsh. So you want to that this year's queen won't be around to make sure that next year's queen is successful. So it's sort of that, R versus K strategy. Like have several of them, and hopefully one of them is successful.
Definitely betters the odds.
You said there were, 252. 70 species in New Brunswick or the Atlantic Canada?
Yeah.
927 across Canada, something like that.
Yeah.
Why, I realize that the diversity, biodiversity in Canada is great. Does that explain the difference?
Like why there aren't more here or why there
Yeah.
are more across Canada.
We should talk about
Um,
biodiversity, I suppose.
Yeah, so I mean there are some species that we see all across Canada. There are also a few biodiversity hotspots in Canada. So like Southern Ontario, the Okanagan actually is another one. So places that have sort of very climates that just support a lot of bees that we don't necessarily find in other parts of the country. So yeah, so I mean, there's bees that you see on the east. There's also sort of if you know, not terribly shocking, but there's kind of a big divide east versus west of the Rockies for a lot of stuff as well. The mountains serve as quite a big dispersal barrier. So yeah, there's species that we see in the west we don't see in the east. There's species we see in the north that we don't see in the south. Or more so in the south, we don't see in the north, and then there's these hot spots. So there's probably species that we're missing as well. They're always finding new ones.
Are there any more
I have
questions?
a question. Do you keep a year list of how many bee species you see in New Brunswick or in the Maritimes? Do you count how many bee species you see?
So we don't have like a standardized count. Like it's sort of like, you know, I have records of all of any project that I have, any research that I'm currently doing. Obviously, we database all of anything that we've collected that year, but it won't necessarily be randomized across New Brunswick. So, you know, if I have a project and I'm working in, you know, wild blueberry, then I'll have records for bees from wild blueberry, but maybe not from other commodities as much or other different habitat types. So it depends. 2022, I did I did sort of try and do a bit of a standardized survey across New Brunswick, PEI, and Nova Scotia, minus Cape Breton, across different habitat types to sort of get baseline data, because one of the things, we don't actually have that much baseline data when it comes to bee abundance and diversity. And so it's really hard to say that species are doing okay or are declining if we don't have any baseline data to compare that to. But it's actually quite challenging to get money to do that kind of work. So we try and tag it into other projects that we have going on so that we can get those kind of numbers. So hopefully, you know, now we have some decent baseline and go back to in, you know, 5 or 10 years to say things are changing or not changing. But that's always a challenge.
Is there an easy way to tell a wild bee from a honeybee?
Yeah, honeybees look like honeybees. Do I have a honeybee? I don't have I think I very deliberately didn't put a honeybee photo in there. But yeah, honeybees are their own species. So a honeybee is just one species. It's Apis mellifera. And
By sight?
yeah, you would recognize one. They have a corbicula. They're sort of a medium-sized bee. They're really the only, now that I think about it, they're really the only like non-bumblebee. Most people can identify a bumblebee because they're big and
Big.
fuzzy.
Yellow ones.
Yeah, so they're really the only non-bumblebee that makes those pollen baskets on the sides of their legs that have those sort of so if you see sort of a medium-sized bee that has those pollen baskets on the sides of their legs, really sort of round clumps, that is almost certainly a honeybee.
They gather nectar or honey or pollen?
Both.
Both, okay.
So yeah, so pollen is the primary source for protein, and nectar is carbohydrates. So they use both of them together. They'll sort of mix it all, and
Mix the honey.
that's what they.
That makes the
Yeah.
honey.
Okay, I seems there are no more. Thank you very, very much. My eyes are open, I'm sure other people's eyes are open. We have quite a few flowers in our garden, so I think tomorrow, no. I think I'm gonna be looking a little bit more carefully. That's a great eye opener, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and most of the bees are really only a centimeter or two, so.
Well, we'll do the tap again.
Sure.
Mr. Comment. What was that last comment?
Oh, I said, yeah, most of the bees that you're gonna see in your garden are only gonna be a centimeter or a centimeter and a half. So once you see them, once you start to see them, you'll see them everywhere.
Okay, good. All right, let's do that again. Wonderful talk.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
We're all excited.
And we'll be in touch if we have any other questions.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Peter, should have asked her, the bears get after them.
Sorry?
Bears,
The bear,
Oh, bears.
Just still there.
Bears,
are they a problem for the bees?
mostly mostly it's honeybees. They have problems with the honeybees because the honey is so
Yeah.
obvious. Most bees don't actually make honey. They just make pollen balls and eggs, and the nests are small, so the bears can't find them, but it's usually honeybees.
Are they predated by any other animals?
Are bees?
Yeah. Is it?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean birds, anything that eats an insect would eat a bee. Anything that's an insectivore.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
They really like my
Bye.
flowers. Bees